Oh, hey, hello world. Welcome to Comic Book News. Hey, we're here today. I've got a super exciting show. We're going to talk to this guy, Jim Rugg. Man, if you watch YouTube and you like comic books and you like good comics and you like good YouTube about comic books, then you probably have heard of Cartoonist kayfabe. We're going to talk to Jim about that. We're going to talk to him about, man, his career in comics, where he's going, where comics are going. We're just going to talk about comics in general, but we're especially going to talk about Octobriana 1976. That's Jim's Blacklight comic. And of course, what we need to probably do is probably turn on the Blacklight. So we should probably, wait, let me just make the adjustment here. Okay, there we go. Great. So without further ado, let's bring in our guest. Oh, wait a minute. But first, I want to talk about one thing. You guys probably know there's a campaign going on about backing the comeback. I got it in the corner here. I got it over here, over there, wherever. And it's all about letting people know that comic book stores are back open. They're getting new products shipped in, and many of them are open for business. It's different from state to state and even locality to locality. But man, what it's all about is making sure that your local comic book store is your first source for comics, right? Everybody knows there's all kinds of places to get comics from online. You can get digital. You can get them at the big bookstore. You can get them from Amazon or wherever. But man, you know your first choice should be your local comic book shop, because not only do you want to support local businesses of all kind, but man, they got the best stuff. Bottom line, right? You want to go to get good comics, you go to the comic book experts, you go to a comic book shop. All right, folks, we're going to bring in Jim Rugg today. We're going to talk about all kinds of things. Now, Jim cannot see your comments. They're turned off for now, but don't worry. Calm down. We're going to do a viewer comments section at the very end. As soon as Jim is sick of talking to me, which probably won't take that long, we're going to switch into some viewer comments and go from there. So without further ado, let's bring in our very special guest, none other than Mr. Jim Rugg. Jim, welcome to the show.
Hi, Dan. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh, man. I'm so excited. This is like a dream come true because, you know, I'm not just a YouTube host and comic fan. I'm a super fan.
I love it, man. Nothing makes me happier than seeing the Cartoonist kayfabe shirts on people. It is a thrill, and I don't think I will ever get tired of it. That's great. Great to see.
Well, the one I want is the one you're wearing right now. That's
yes.
That to me is your best design. And I'll be ordering that one pretty soon. Let me get up here so everybody can make sure we see this. So today we're going to talk about, your Kickstarter campaign, but let's get it out of the way. Cartoonist kayfabe, what is that? First of all, what is kayfabe?
Kayfabe is a Carney term. Well, first of all, Cartoonist kayfabe is my YouTube comics channel with fellow Pittsburgh cartoonist Ed Piskor. And we talk about comics from a lot of different directions, making comics. We interview creators that we like. Chris Claremont, we just posted today a big interview with the X-Men writer, Chris Claremont. We review comics. We kind of go through them and talk about them from our vantage point, both as readers and fans, but also as makers. We show off our own work. We talk about our own practices. A lot of which is work in progress. You know, Ed and I have both been making comics as long as we've been doing the YouTube channel, and about 20 years before it started. You know, but we talk about the comics that are in progress. Sometimes we go back and we look at our old comics, almost like a director's commentary, going through and asking each other, you know, questions that we have as fellow creators, because despite knowing each other for a long time, we still approach comics making differently, you know? So I'll see things that he does and want to know, like, where'd you come up with this? Or why'd you do it that way? So it's comics in whatever way we can think of to, you know, to look at comics. We were fans before we were makers. So you put that together and we've got decades of both reading and making comics and just love to get into it. And it grew out of, we're both from Pittsburgh. We would travel to comic book shows together. And sometimes those are long road trips. And that's, you know, what we have in common is comics. So that would be a road trip of talking about comics, a weekend at the convention talking about comics, and a ride home debriefing on whatever we came up with that weekend that we thought was interesting comics wise. And we we recognized like it was very engaging to us, so we assumed it would be valuable to other people, and started the Cartoonist Kayfabe as a result. And feedback's been great. A lot of people sit at home and make comics, and you want something to listen to or something to watch kind of in the background. And we hear from a lot of cartoonists that they enjoy the show for that reason. So whether you're making it or reading it, we say read more comics, make more comics. It's kind of been our mantra since we started this thing. Well, and kayfabe is it's a carnival term that comes from, we know it from wrestling. And in wrestling, it basically means it's a secret language the wrestlers share to maintain the illusion of the reality of professional wrestling. So if you see a civilian coming up, you say kayfabe, and you get back and you stay in character so that they don't know that you're really friends, maybe behind the scenes.
So the idea is that you're breaking kayfabe with your show, right? That's the conceit of your show.
In a lot of ways, it is. It's also alliterative. So that
right. Oh, nothing better than that.
We learned it from Stan Lee.
Right. Well, I don't know if you saw my recent Gary Groth Grills GFEs, Jeffies Gently, but I'm a big fan of that myself. Anyway, you'll notice the Pittsburgh logo up in the corner that I just put there because little known fact, Danny Shaheen, born in Pittsburgh, PA. I moved to San Jose when I was 1. All right. So I'm kind of a Pittsburgh wannabe. I'm kind of a Pittsburgh poser, if you will, if you want to get alliterative with it, because I grew up hearing all these Pittsburgh things all the time. And so in order to curry favor with both you and your audience, today we're going to play a little game I like to call Spot the Shoehorn. Okay. And today, as you can see, we've got a Steelers shoehorn here that I Googled for diligently. And what's going to happen today is that we're going to talk about comics. And every once in a while, I'm going to just drop in a reference that is a Pittsburgh specific reference that, all yins can get behind and understand. Right.
Well done.
So when I do that, Jim, I want you to just put your finger up. Like just
I will point to the Steeler logo.
Yes. Perfect. So I don't want to derail the conversation, but I might say something like, Jack Kirby, known for being a clutch player, being able to get in there and really meet those deadlines and perform under pressure. Some have called him the Terry Bradshaw of comics. How do you feel about that? You see where I'm going with this?
I do, okay? Yeah. Hopefully they're a little better than that example. No offense.
That was ham-fisted, I'll agree, but that was my go-to example. Okay, so let's get into this. Let's talk about Octobriana. Tell me about Blacklight Comics. Why, what? Go into it, please.
All right. So Octobriana 1976 is currently my Kickstarter. It's up right now. It's live. You guys could stop listening right now and go and pledge for it. And it's 2 main parts. One is it's the world's first Blacklight comic. And the way it becomes Blacklight is because it's printed with fluorescent ink. I do a lot of stuff in terms of making. I've screen printed. I've designed screen prints. I draw with ballpoint pens. I make zines. I do a lot of different, different media, different creative outlets. It's just kind of follows my interest. And so I had made some Blacklight screen prints years ago, and I realized the process. Well, one, I got the screen prints back and they were beautiful, fluorescent ink, so bright. And I thought this would make a great comic book. Like, why isn't there a comic book that was printed this way? And I looked around and I couldn't find one, and finally decided I'm going to make one myself. And so Octobriana 1976 is my attempt to make a Blacklight comic using fluorescent inks. And we can get into the technical part in a little bit if you want to go down that road or not. As long as it's looks like a Blacklight print or a Blacklight poster, everybody should be happy. We don't, the technical stuff can be maybe on the back end. But so the other piece of it.
Quick question about that. Okay. So does that mean this is going to look best under a black light, or is it meant to be read in the light of day, or what's I'm a little unclear on that part.
It should look great under either. If you have a black light or a black light room, it'll be perfect for you. But my response was just in daylight. I saw these fluorescent inks, and I was like, I absolutely love this palette. It's as simple as that. It was this visceral reaction I had to these colors. that really spoke to me and made me want to use that palette more. Colors become such an important part of comics. It's really shifted in the last couple of decades. And to me, this is the best palette I've seen, and I haven't seen it applied to comics. So, even for your viewers that are seeing this on screen, these are placeholders. This is not the colors because you can't replicate the fluorescent ink on a screen. So what you're seeing is saturated colors, but what you will see in print, the actual comic book, is going to be much, much brighter, much more fluorescent. And in fact, we print the fluorescent inks twice in order to charge the fluorescence, which has to do with their opacity level, essentially. But that's what makes them kind of glow under the blacklight. And so, there is some technical process that is challenging, but I think we have figured out. And I'm really excited to see it because, again, I look at a million comics. I go to these comics festivals and you see thousands of comics laid out, and some of them stand out more than others. To me, this is going to be the comic that pops. You could be across the room and you're going to be able to see this one. Should be really interesting on a coffee table. If you're somebody who's into interesting printed matter, this should be one of the most interesting looking comics of all time. The other part of this comic that I'm in love with is Octobriana. Octobriana, I like comics history. I like weird comics. Octobriana comes from a book in 1971 called Octobriana in the Russian Underground. And the idea is a defector from the Soviet Union smuggled illegal underground Russian comic books, superhero comics, starring Octobriana. And she was this underground character that fought the Soviet oppression of the era and was kind of this mythological Russian figure that went back. She's immortal, and she, again, the spirit of the October Revolution, the goddess of war. She has all of this great history, and it all was in this book from 1971, like a 200-page book that was mostly text, just talking about this character, talking about the underground Russian group of like artists and writers and college students who made these illegal comics. The comics were called samizdat, which in Russian means publish it yourself. But anything that you published yourself was highly illegal. Everything was censored. The state owned all of the printing mechanisms, from Xerox machines to printing plants, and everything had to go through there. So if you printed it yourself, that was illegal contraband, no matter what the content was.
I mean, talk about underground comics with some stakes, right? And some like bite. This is not just Robert Crumb with a baby buggy selling comics on Hay Street. This is
exactly.
They're going to come and they're going to erase you, and you're going to be in a gulag somewhere.
Absolutely. So, this is real. This is when we say outlaw comics, this may be the most outlaw of any outlaw comic because of those illegal stakes. So this book is published in 1971 in England, and it turns out, of course, all of it's a hoax, which just adds to kind of the great mystique, because it's this character that was created as like the people's character. There's no copyright or anything. And pretty soon other cartoonists are wondering, is this true? It's fascinating. Is there an underground contingent of Russian cartoonists that comes out of the 60s? It's really inspired by Western superheroes. So think of the 60s as like Jack Kirby in the Marvel Universe. Octobriana fits with those kinds of characters. She's larger than life. She's very dynamic. It's this big, powerful character. And so if you think of it,
is there a copyright owner?
No.
Is it considered public domain? So it's true origins, though. You're saying this is a made up story. Who made up the story, and then is there just no effort to have a copyright, or the idea is it's sort of an open source kind of like public domain?
Right. Scenario? So what happened is the author actually stole artwork from a couple of Czech artists, and he doctored it. He tried to sell it first as like this Amazon character. He failed to do that. He was kind of struggling to get by. I think he was arrested at one point for being homeless in the streets of Paris. And eventually he finds his way to a publisher in the UK, Tom Stacey, who was this like sort of this neo right-wing reporter, historian, who was globetrotting and writing about it and publishing these historical books, some of which went into academia. And so I think he saw Octobriana in that story, and it fit within, kind of his ideology. And so he publishes it. And I think he published it under the belief that this is all legitimate. There's introductory materials by legitimate ex-Russian writers, political activists that are real people, and they're writing about real situations in the USSR at the time. So it's very much like created to look like a real object and presented that way. And the author never admitted that it wasn't true. It's just all the other stuff came up. Like the Czech artist eventually sued him, for stealing their artwork. So it's pretty clear that it's not accurate. But of course, that spins all kinds of tales.
Doesn't that make it better in every way that it's not real?
I love it. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests for FBI and CIA records on Octobriana, and so far I've gotten one on Octobriana. So that's going to be one of the stretch goals. Is I'm going to put together what I call a checklist for Octobriana. Like fanzines and comics fans history is often full of us doing these checklists and compiling all of our favorite artists or characters' histories. I'm going to do one with Octobriana because what else happens besides the whole mess of real world, what's real and what isn't? A bunch of cartoonists start using Octobriana in comic books, starting with Brian Talbot in Luther Arkwright, one of the great underground indie comic graphic novels. And, it's followed suit by a lot. Like she's appeared in adult comics, she's appeared in indie comics, she's appeared in comics in England and Europe. And so there's kind of this whole history of her as a character floating around, apparently copyright free and public domain. So, I just find her to be a fascinating character, both within the comics, but then also the backstory behind her history.
Me too. And what even makes this an additionally interesting wrinkle from my perspective is that this is a crowdfunded campaign, on Kickstarter. And I don't know if you know, there's controversy about crowdfunding comics and supporting comic shops, which I know 100% that you love comic book shops and you support them because you've had retailers on your show. You talk about the great retail shops all the time. That's a focus of your show as well. As an ex-retailer, that's really important to me. But I see a reticence among many retailers. This is what they would say. This is what they will say. Some will say. They'll say, look, I love Jim Rugg's comics. I got some Jim Rugg fans that shop in my store. But they're supporting this Kickstarter. So Jim Rugg, when he does this, it's great. But if he wants me to have it in my store, he already soaked up my customers ahead of time. So, so what am I supposed to do? What do you say to that?
If you really believe that, if you don't think this is a comic book you can sell, you shouldn't order it for your store. I am clear on the Kickstarter page that it's going through previews. It's going through Diamond. As soon as I can get it through there, I do love comic shops and I certainly don't want them to go away. But they are, it is a niche market. And the truth is, as a cartoonist, I need to reach a wider audience than I have reached so far through that market. So I've talked to several retailers. I talked to them before I launched the Kickstarter to get their input. What works for retailers? And the answers were mostly lukewarm. It is kind of hard to make all those pieces balance. And so what I've been doing is, as retailers reach out to me, I've compiled a list. And as soon as books are available, I will reach out to them and they can either deal with me directly. They can deal with Diamond if that works best for them. And certainly if they think this is not something that they can sell, they it's not charity. So, they shouldn't do it. But I'm interested in selling comics in every way, shape, and form possible. I've wanted to do a crowdfunder for a while because it's just a different distribution model, in my opinion. And I want to explore these. My goal is to get comics in front of interested readers. And hopefully some of those come from comic shops. But I know not all of them come from comic shops because, quite frankly, look at the numbers of top selling books. There are a lot of people that I think would be interested in comics if they found them, if they knew they existed. And for some people, that means Kickstarter. And conversely, some people aren't going to buy something on Kickstarter no matter what. And I want to service those people too.
Exactly.
So hopefully I can have a friendly relationship with these shops.
Yes. Not to mention the fact that the support you should get on Kickstarter from your hardcore and the ability to see what that support and what the quality of the work is going to be. If a retailer can look at it and say, man, that's something I would love. And I know I got customers I can sell good comics to. There's that. But the nuts and bolts of it, if you don't mind, let's get a little bit specific on this. Like, do you have a tier for retailers? Some crowdfunding things, especially in games, have a special tier for retailers where if they buy in quantity, they get a higher discount. Let me just start with that.
I don't. And that is the thing that I asked several of my retailer friends about directly. And the answers led me to not do that. That's a tough tier to make work. And so my answer is I will deal them to you directly, or Ad House will deal them to you directly, or again, they will go through Diamond. So if that's your best system, they'll be available through that channel. And I plan to continue to support this book and the retailers in one way is once the books show up and I see them, I will make sure retailers can look at those books and decide for themselves, is this as advertised? Is this something I believe people, I can stop people or it will stop people in the store and it will draw their attention. I don't want retailers to be stuck with books they can't sell either. So, if that's a better model for them, I'm happy to accommodate that. I'll show you a video of a flip through. I'll send you a sample, whatever works.
Well, what's the price going to be in previews? And what's the difference between the date that your Kickstarter backers are going to get it and it's going to be available in stores?
It'll probably be 1 to 2 months difference. And quite honestly, I can't tell you the exact date when it will be in stores. In a lot of ways, I think Diamond, I think we're still figuring out Diamond shipping schedule, all of that stuff, solicitation.
Right, of course.
And I'm going to make sure that my Kickstarter backers get the books first. It is one of the perks. I do appreciate their support. It's been overwhelming, quite frankly. And so, if you're going to support it, I want to get it to you first. The cover price is going to be $10 for, at retail level.
Okay, great. That sounds like a really great price point for something like this. I think for how many pages? It's
24-page comic plus covers, and the story is actually 26 pages because it starts on the inside cover and ends on the inside cover.
I mean, that sounds, in today's market, especially with high production values and everything else, that sounds like a sellable price point in today's comic book store. So there's that. I think some of the, because when I talk about this stuff with my retailer pals, it's the same objections, right? The objections are, though, a lot of them boil down to the day and date issue. Whereas I think if somebody could come up with crowdfunding methodology where it's going to ship to retailers and be available in stores at roughly the same time that it's shipping to customers, that creates something that then the retailer can get behind the campaign as well and use that to promote it in their own store or whatever. And then also discount levels. And as was brought up to me by Milton Greep, an analyst of the comics and games industry, the games industry does things for retailers like not require the full payment up front, because the other objection from a retailer is, I'm gonna have to tie up my money for 6 months to wait for Jim and wait for the printers and wait for everything else. I could be spending that on X-Men or whatever, right? So what they do in the games industry is let them do an escrow sort of thing where they pay a little percentage down, like 10% for a 10 copy tier. And then maybe even offer some returnability to get people behind larger tiers. There's a lot of models that I think are worth exploring, and I want to see that happen really badly.
I agree 100%. And some of that stuff is a little bit beyond me. If I'm going through Diamond, I can't do the choices or the something like an escrow 10% down. That's not something I can control, but I certainly can control some direct interactive back and forth between me and a retailer. So if they want to deal directly with me, I am open to that and happy to accommodate them in anything that is reasonable.
I think you're kind of conflating two. The points that I'm making is I'm saying that you could do a crowdfunded tier. This is what they do in the games. They do a retailer tier, say that says 10 copies. You give me enough for 1 copy, right? But I'm going to print 10 for you. And when the time comes, we're going to ship you those 10. You're going to pay me then, right? At a discount level that's more realistic, like 50% off free shipping, which is standard in the book trade, right? That's right. What they're used to get, not from Diamond, that ain't standard, but from any publisher, that's the deal. So in my opinion, that would be a really cool incentive that retailers could get behind.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's the first I've heard that. And that is an interesting one, Dan. It's one I will think about. And again, what I wonder about too is the number of retailers that have expressed interest, and this is with me reaching out to several of them, it's such a small number, So on one hand, it's very easy to just be flexible and like, let's work together, if there's a small number that wants this. But I am open to figuring out a retailer tier. And quite honestly, every retailer that has reached out to me directly, I have asked them that, is there a tier? What is an ideal tier for you? And the truth is, most of them come back with, they would rather just deal, The alternative is I will email you the second books are available and we can work out an order.
Let me tell you, if you nail day and date and the 10% down issue, I guarantee you I know some retailers specifically who said if that happened, they could get on board and they would be super stoked. Because, a great man once said, before you can win a game, you have to not lose it. I think that was the great Chuck Noll, if I'm not mistaken. So,
the greatest. Why is he not talked about more?
Yeah, right, exactly. Especially in the context of comics, right? So,
exactly.
Moving on. Let's. So that's great. We're talking crowdfunding. We're talking Octobriana. I want to just talk more. Let's go to the past, right? That's the future, right? Because crowdfunding is the future, figuratively and literally in this case, because the book's not out yet. Let's go all the way back. Let's go back to Street Angel, right? This is
where your hometown now.
This is where, okay, right, exactly. This is where we come to San Jose. So tell me, what's the secret origins of Street Angel?
Street Angel comes out in about 2003. I had been making mini comics. I had gotten, I'd grown very far away from like the Marvel DC characters and that style of storytelling. I found alternative comics and I was doing mini comics. It was at a bad time in the comics industry, the early 2000s, the late 90s. We used to joke that you'd go to these shows like SPX and it was one $5 bill that would just pass from table to table because we all just traded our mini comics with each other. So I spent a couple years making mini comics, auto-bio stuff, weird stuff, nonfiction, things like that. And finally, I decided to make a superhero comic because that's what I grew up on. I loved them. And I was tired of what I was seeing in comic book stores. It felt like it was just the same, all the same. And so Street Angel was the opposite of everything that I was seeing at comic book stores. And I made a mini comic. And in the process, I started working with a writing partner, Brian Maruca, who I still work with. Very nice to have that. And we generated several ideas, more than an issue, but we only, we made one issue. And I took it to my next mini comic event and it sold out right away. And that was different. I'd been doing these shows, 4 or 5 of them a year. I kind of knew what to expect. And when it sold, it told me that other people, I had something, people were interested. So I came home and thought, I want to make more of this. People like it. I should find a publisher because I think, at that point I had been doing it for a couple of years, comics. And I felt like this was good enough to have a publisher and be seen by more people.
Okay,
and slave labor graphics.
Enter important figure in indie comics. Let's name. Let's not talk slave labor graphics. Let's talk my pal and fellow Dan Vaughn.
Yes.
Okay.
So Dan Vado
and slave labor. Tell me about that.
He goes back to the black and white boom explosion of comics in the mid 80s and he starts publishing. He's a creator. He's writing comics. Samurai Penguin, I believe, was the first SLG publication. And cut to the early 2000s. At that point, he had done like Jonan Vasquez's Johnny the Homicidal Maniac was one of their top selling books. And it was kind of like this goth humor, great comic. He also published Evan Dorkin in Dork, one of my favorite comics ever. So
geez, right?
All, when you start looking at SLG's catalog, you'll be shocked because they published a very wide range of comics, you'll know them for whatever comic you know them for. And when you start digging, you'll be stunned that it's every genre. It's tons of great cartoonists. So I knew enough about what they published to look around comics and be like, this is a publisher that is targeting more readers than the typical publisher. And that's what I wanted. It's what I've always wanted. Comics should be for everybody. And so I followed their submission guideline online and I sent them exactly what they called for. And a week later, Dan called me and, he was on board and off we went. So that was my first real publishing experience. They did 5 issues of Street Angel, I think 2004 to 2005, something like that. And from there, that kind of got the eye of a lot of other people. And it led ultimately to me doing the Plain Jane's graphic novels at DC Comics with editor Shelley Bond. That was their young adult imprint, probably ahead of its time in a lot of ways, but a great experience. And I had a checklist of things that I wanted to do, because I say that I'm self-taught as a cartoonist. I went to school for graphic design, which has served me really well, but it's not comics. And so in my mind, it was like, at some point, I want to work through that editorial system and see what I can learn from an editor. And Shelley Bond, longtime editor at Vertigo Comics, she's been at IDW. She's a phenomenal editor. I don't even know how many Eisners she's won, and all the talent that she brought into Vertigo, from Gerard Way to Paul Pope to Gilbert Hernandez, just phenomenal. And it was a great experience. I learned a ton on those books. So, that was like the next step, and it came directly from Street Angel. She literally has files of artists. And so whenever she starts up this young adult line, she had Cecil Castellucci, who was a young adult prose writer and had a story concept. And then it was like, find an artist to work with. And so she laid out a bunch of artist samples. Mine were some of them. And that's what Cecil responded to. And we just started working together.
Can I tell you, I looked this up. I came up on Google Books and I read the first 52 pages that are available to read there. Okay. And, dude, it brought me back to a time and place in my own life when I had problems figuring out what group I connected with. And it started me thinking about comic book shops and how my spot was the comic book. I was working there since I was 11. It was the only spot that had, my people, my tribe. And like, dude, that put me in a place that like, I got really, I'm getting emotional thinking about it right now because like that book is really affecting to me. And it's those kind of books that are coming out now, like Raina Telgemeier's, you read Guts. I know, Raina. Guts is an emotional masterpiece, for kids, like the most difficult issue for the most difficult audience. And it's setting up this future of comics readers that are attuned to it as an art form that can tackle any subject matter and is being done by guys and gals like yourself and Raina that have a deep love and understanding of the masters and the roots of the art form. And it just sets up a future for me that just says comics forever, man. We're like the next 20 years from now, who knows what great stuff we're going to have.
It's the most optimistic thing I feel about comics is when you see that demographic, the all ages demographic, is growing for that exact reason, Dan, because in my mind, it's like you hook this young generation on comics, they'll take me to retirement. Like it's perfect. But it's also, like we lost that generation. When I was reading comics in the 90s, so much of comics were geared toward, I don't even want to say adult exactly, but it wasn't juvenile. Kids. It wasn't all ages.
Juvenile is the word for it. It's juvenile.
And it's any industry has to bring in a new generation, regardless of what age your industry services. You need new people entering that age because inevitably everybody's aging out and eventually dying. So to not get kids at that all ages young age, I mean, that's how comics history was built. And we really skipped it one generation.
Dude, totally. They had tiers, right? Where you could start with, even at my age and your age growing up, it was like, you could start with Richie Rich. They were around. You could get it for 75 cents or whatever. And you start there. Then you get into superheroes maybe, or Mad Magazine or something else. And you're buying this cheap stuff on a regular basis. And then it's like superheroes. And then suddenly if you're reading comics in the 80s, the most brilliant creators start dropping. Frank Miller. I got a copy of Frank Miller Daredevil I found in my brother's drawer that I read, and it terrified me.
Yeah.
It's the one where he's on the cover, the white cover, where his,
a great issue.
His are overwhelming. And I'm looking at this thing and I'm reading it. And then we had something, right? But there was no adult level. There was no respect yet at the adult level. And now we're in this time. We won that battle in the libraries, the schools. They are behind comics 100%. There's material for the youngest, Jeff Smith and whatever Scholastic can put out. There's still superhero comics and stuff that are pretty good for a teenager, I think. And then there's this whole world of literature and adult comics and everything else out there that we're set up for success, man. If we can just keep some of these stores alive, we're going to see some awesome stuff.
I'm excited to see what like the next generation of stores look like. I've done book signing tours and I've traveled. Anytime I travel anywhere, I'm looking at comic book stores, and you can almost tell, like when those stores opened. There are several stores here on the East Coast where you go in. There's one in Pittsburgh, Ides, that was open in the late 70s, early 80s, and they were those stores that were like, there was music and then there were movies and comics. It was this whole, I don't know, like mashup of mass media. And there are other stores like that. Criminal in Atlanta is a little bit like that, Yeah. And you go in and it's like, it's a really good comic store, but it is also a record shop. And, you see these parallels where it's like, I bet that store opened in the 80s. It's almost a model. And I'm excited to see what the next model is. When I did a tour in the West Coast a few years ago, and probably the oldest store I saw was like 10 years old. And I came back and was like just telling tales to everybody about like the totally different landscape of comic book stores, and it was a newer model. The guys running them were, it was a different business setup. The spaces looked very different. The staffs, looked different. It was just a very different comic book experience in the store and a retail level than I was used to. And
right.
I still, you still see that stuff pop up. We talk about different stores. Escape Pod Comics on Long Island is one of these stores where I went and did a signing there and found so many books I didn't even know existed. Like that guy's pulling from all over the place. And you would see him doing customer service as people would come in, being able to like talk for a minute and a half with somebody and point to a few books that, oh, if you like that, check this out.
That's something you're not going to get online. And that's something where like people underestimate what a turbocharger for the comics industry, the explosion of the direct market in the 80s was. It's like that infrastructure coming into place and these independently owned shops, no chains, no corporations, just dudes opening and whoever opening shops, right? And like throwing comics and baseball cards and whatever, creating this thing. And then, but the content then that started appearing, Alan Moore and all the DC stuff. And, it just upped the game to such a degree. It was amazing. And I came into being a comic shop owner. I bought my store around 2001, 2002. And that was right after the Spider-Man movie came out. Okay. And this was the store I grew up working in. And it was a baseball card shop, tiny kind of hole in the wall thing that barely made it through the implosion of the market by selling Pokemon cards. Pokemon cards literally kept this store in business for several years, and it would have been gone without it. And by the time I took it over, I tried to do this different thing, right? I wanted to do that. I wanted to be the bookstore model of comic book shops, right? But I made a critical error, in my opinion. I discarded the idea of collectability and also of just used product in general. And that was big mistake, because there's some stuff you can only get as used comic books, and they are legitimately rare and hard to find. What I did do right, in my opinion, was I focused on an all ages section and stocking all the very best material as a humongous section of my store. And I feel like that is the future model for comics, is going to be based around that, but it's got to somehow bring the used, the back issue, the fanzines, the stuff, like the stacks of stuff that you can get your hands on, because that's the best stores that I go to.
It is a weird thing with comics, and there's been so much talk lately about the comics industry saving it, what it needs to do, and all this stuff. And it makes me think about, my interaction with comics. And it is tough in that, one, it's not a big group. I don't know how many people actually go to comic book shops, but it might be 1 million people or less. It's not a huge number. But that group, like, I'm a comics fan. I think I don't think anyone doubts that I love comics. But
oh, yeah.
But, there's another person who loves comics equally, who all they buy is Spider-Man or Batman, and they have, boxes and boxes of Batman comics. And clearly they love comics, but we don't overlap at all. There's the person who is buying and selling Silver Age comics and, worried about condition of those and buying CGC books. And I don't overlap with that person either, but they're a part of comics, and a big part, a significant piece of comics is that type of a collector. And so it's a weird thing too, that we try to figure out, like, we're sort of all in this together, but also not really, like comics are a thing that overlaps a little bit, but also the stuff I'm interested in may not interest that person at all, and vice versa.
True. What I want to say though, is what I've always been taken with that, I think you'll agree with this, but I don't know, is that in the Venn diagram, right, of like people in the comics industry, right, you got your collectors and you got your art types that only read arty graphic novels, and you got your superhero fans, and you got your eBay flippers, and you got everything else. Dude, there is an overlap amongst all of those at the core of it. There's nobody who's getting into comics because it's just stocks and bonds, like it's just pure numbers game. Like somewhere there was a core of I like comics. And there's also a huge overlap between the guys that like the Chris Ware stuff and the arty alternative stuff, and who like the mainstream superhero stuff. There's a humongous overlap in those circles that your channel, I love. because it brings that to the forefront. Like, you're not just talking to the snobby guys who are going to make it seem like the coolest and the highest quality content. You're talking to the commercial people, and you're looking at Wizard magazine, and then you look at the Comics Journal, the next one, and you dive deep into them, and you treat them as equally important, but in different ways. Okay. And
my circle is pretty big, the stuff that I look at. And I do like some snobby stuff, but I also like some real garbage. I've had Tom Scioli, a friend of mine, say, I like comics that only their mother would like, the creators of those comics, So I have a pretty wide spectrum, and I love your example of Wizard to Comics Journal, because like Wizard is the anti-snob book. So we definitely try to have that. I personally, look, I like what I like, and it happens to be very, very broad. But, two groups that you don't name, I do think there's a group that's mostly in this for numbers. Forbes magazine ran an article probably 10 to 15 years ago, and it was about the value in comic book art, like originals. And we've seen that market just explode. When somebody's paying $600,000 for a McFarlane cover, that's an investment that may or may not have anything to do with their love of comics. That's purely something that is, I think, a number-based move.
Well, my pushback to that would just be that, if you got $600 grand to drop on something, there's a lot of things you could invest that $600 grand in. Right?
I'll say it this way. I know people that buy art as investment for people. And those people that are investing that money don't necessarily even know what that art buyer is buying. It's literally an investment. And so like
portfolio management.
Yes, exactly.
I see.
You're diversifying a portfolio is what you're doing. And some of it goes into something like art, because historically that's appreciated in value. And comics art is one of those things that art buyers looked at and went, this is less than it should be. I don't know if that's the case anymore, but boy, do I kick myself for all the stuff I didn't buy. You used to be able to buy complete Jack Kirby Fourth World books for $6,000 or $7,000 from the Kirby family. Oh, wouldn't you like to time travel back to the early 90s and do that? But the other group that we don't mention is Raina's audience, which may be bigger than all the other numbers put together. Like the Dog Boy books, 25 million copies sold in the last 5 years. Those are just readers, and some of them, maybe they will become cartoonists, but a micro percentage, if you think of the number of 20 million plus copies sold. So that's another giant group.
Well, true.
Doesn't give a shit about Wizard or Comics Journal.
A micro percentage of anyone who reads comics is going to get into creating them, or any art form. But what's great now is that, sure, the percentage might still be small, but now the numbers is these hundreds of millions of kids and whatever. It's like, we're going to see some stuff, man. It's going to be great.
To tie it all back into the comic store and future of or present comic stores, I think, honestly, it's really individual by store as to what model works and what their store looks like. And they know who their customers are. And furthermore, what kind of business they want to run. Like maybe there is a market for one of those groups that we mentioned, but maybe the store owner has no interest in shifting that direction, So I think the stores, like the comics buying, reading public in general, I don't know that grouping them all together does helps us in this conversation. I really think it's like each store is an individual business.
Oh, well, there's no doubt about that. There's no one model that's going to dominate the future. And I think what you're nailing, though, is as a creator, we're already in it. We're in a multi-channel world, right? You know that. You got to be selling online, in bookstores, at book shows. You got to be on YouTube. You got to be on Facebook. You got to be on Instagram. You've got an amazing social media presence outside of Cartoonist kayfabe. I was like, how do I find some info about this Jim Rugg dude? Usually I go to Wikipedia, right? But like Wikipedia ain't got nothing on your website, dude. I want to pull that up for a second here just to show people that they should check this out for sure. Right. And we'll take a look. Yeah, and this is just the art page. And it just gives you a little sample of the breadth of kind of stuff that Jim's worked on. And it's really a great site. It's got your full history, talks about everything about you. I want everybody to go check that out. And also please back the Kickstarter campaign. So Jim, I want to pivot a little bit. Street Angel. We just talked about Street Angel and what a thrill ride it was. It's like something out of Kennywood Park or something. You know what I mean? It's like, it's wild. It's crazy. It's all over the place. And after Street Angel, you moved on to Plain Janes, which we talked about a little bit. It's emotional. It's great. Those are the bifurcation in your career, and you talked specifically about it already. Of like, one is you're a pure cartoonist in the sense that you wrote it, you drew it, and even you're doing the separate. You're doing everything: the lettering, the zip-a-tone, the post-production, the pre-production. You're involved at least with every step of the way in that stuff. And then you move to corporate, edited, mass market, or aimed at the mass market anyway, books like Plain Janes. And you nailed it when you said how ahead of its time it is. Like that same concept right now dropping would sell way more copies than it did then, because DC now has a whole imprint. I don't know if you've seen all the new DC books that are coming out and how they are just aping the Scholastic format.
I have, yeah, and I'm glad they're doing that. It's great.
I agree, but here's where I quibble. I go, they're picking people I've never seen before to make comics. Like, and nothing wrong with that, right? We want fresh people, but there are so many incredibly talented veteran cartoonists and artists and writers that if you were to take them and that are used to taking editing and working within that edited system, you could point them at that stuff too, and you'd come up with some really, really, really super awesome comics as far as I don't want to castigate anything that's going on in those comics, but those are not people have put in the 20, 30 years that it takes to become a great cartoonist. So, and hopefully they will be someday. Any thoughts on that? Like on the old school, the super talented cartoonists trying to move into this new world of graphic novels and all ages stuff and whatever?
You know, I like those books. The ones that I've seen, I've been very happy with. You know, I know some people who work on those, and I feel like the results are great. And quite frankly, they're new media. You know, I know for a fact some of them are drawn on iPads and things.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not married to black ink lines on paper, so I like seeing this new media. Like, it's really exciting to me that I can reproduce ballpoint pen drawings perfectly, or I can draw in pencil and reproduce that. And so I think it's good to have new blood. If you're going for a new audience, bring in some new visual language. And, you know, quite frankly, those books, they're done at a very low rate. You know, part of the reason Plain Janes was the same way whenever I started it. Right. So, you know, part of the reason you get a new person is because these veterans have a certain page rate, and it's a shame if they can't pay it on this new book, but it's also the fact that there's what is and there's what would be great. You know, what the ideal isn't always the what is. And so sometimes you get a new person because they're willing to do the book for this amount of time, or to turn it around very quickly, or to color it themselves. You know, I have no problem with new people coming in. I think it's the lifeblood of comics, and it's always been that way. You know, we were looking at X-Men #1, Jim Lee's X-Men #1 from 1991. And I think he starts making comics in like 1986 or 1985, starts professionally. Right. And so very quickly, you know, he was turning heads. Like, he gets the Punisher War Journal a year or two into his, you know, working professional life. And it's just like, who is this guy? It does look different. It is exciting. So I think new is a good thing. But it was true in wrestling too. You know, like, this is what territories used to do, is it's like, you got it. People want the new. So if you're trying to generate, you know, excitement and bring in new readers, I think it's a good direction to go. And also keep the veterans on other books. You know, like, it's not like it's one or the other. Like, DC's still publishing monthly comics, so they don't get rid of, you know, whoever the talented guy is that's been doing it for 20 years. But maybe for the new book aimed at the new audience, maybe you do try somebody new there. You need to try somebody new somewhere.
Great point. It's like, you know, in wrestling, like you're saying, it's like the new school guys who I've never heard of before versus someone like, I don't know, maybe like a Bruno Sammartino or somebody along those lines, you know, who hails from a certain territory, a specific territory. That
the great Bruno Sammartino.
Oh, that's right. He is from Pittsburgh. I forgot about that.
I've drawn Bruno Sammartino. You got to draw the hometown heroes.
So tell me, okay, we talked about digital comics for a second there. How much do you release digitally? How many digital comics do you read? Like, if you had a choice between a digital comic and a paper comic, would you ever in a million years take a digital comic of any kind over a physical comic?
Man, I feel like I'm going to get a backlash over this, but I've been reading more and more digitally because some stuff, that's the only place it's available. Like sometimes I'm doing research and I just don't have any other way to read it, like for the show or whatever. Sometimes stuff doesn't exist in print or doesn't exist in English in print. And so I found myself reading more on my iPad, and I've grown to like it. It's bright. I read at night, and I don't have a well-lit spot to read. So a lot of comics, they print dark. I've gotten accustomed to it, and I don't mind it. It has benefits. It's a trade-off. I love print a lot. I don't know how much you can see, but I am like surrounded by flammable objects. If a spark happened right now, you would see me instantly go up, because I love paper. I still make stuff for paper. This Octobriana 1976, paper is the way to experience it. It can't be, it's something I'm doing that can't really be done digitally. So I love paper, but I do read a lot on an iPad, and I'm in love with the color palettes. I like that I can adjust the lighting and it's bright enough for me to see it. I can zoom in on things if my old eyes can't read it very well, or if the art's beautiful and I want to take a closer look. It's an attractive thing. But I do think you have to work for that. I often make files that are, this is the digital file, this is the print file, because there's a difference. They don't reproduce. Because it looks good on screen doesn't mean it reproduces well. And so I often make two sets of files for that purpose.
What I think is really interesting here is the the mainstream stuff, the Marvel, DC stuff, whatever, the stuff that goes through Comixology. Okay, they have whatever that process is where they got to break up the page so that you could like read it panel by panel, and they zoom it, and essentially they're turning it into an animatic, in my opinion. And it's not, it becomes not a comic when you introduce motion into it, in my opinion. Like, any thoughts on that? Like, to me, if I'm going to read a comic digitally, it better just be a page, like a PDF that I can just zoom in on when I need to, but I need to be able to see the whole page. And the lack of ability to see a double page spread and stuff like that, and lay it flat, and paper stock, while subtle, is definitely a part of the equation for me. So like, I start getting into the book as an object as opposed to the comic as an idea, right? And I don't know that one's right or one's wrong about that. It's personal preferences and trade-offs, right?
Yeah, I'm not even sure to agree or disagree with you, because it's so case by case. I haven't read a lot on Comixology. I typically read in a Chunky reader. Chunky is the app. And so I can control one page or spread, but it's not that guided panel view. It's tough because a lot of the Comixology stuff, I think, is created in a certain assembly line system. And so we read David Mazzucchelli interview in the Comics Journal, and he talked about, he's a guy for people at home. He did Daredevil for a while, and he did Daredevil Born Again with Frank Miller, and then he did Batman Year One. And then he went and did Rubber Blanket and started doing this more artsy stuff on his own, doing some really challenging print things. And in the interview, he said that he learned while working at Marvel that you want to be the last guy to touch the work before it goes to the press. And I think what you see in most of these like monthly comics in this system, everything is geared towards deadline. Nobody's really responsible. If the book doesn't look good, you can be like, well, the colorist screwed it up, or, the letter put the balloons in the wrong place, or, you can always kind of pass the buck. The writer can say the artist, he rushed and he didn't really draw what I wrote. And so no one's responsible for it. And again, you give it to Comixology, it goes through some automated system, and boom, you've got it on screen. Do the colors look good? Are the panels big enough? I don't know. Who cares? Who's responsible? And this is what you get. So sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, maybe. But like, I would do stuff on Webtoons for a little bit. And Webtoons is a comic phone app. And you learn very quickly, a 2-page spread literally does not work on the width of a phone. So if you're just adapting your comics, every now and then you're going to have this wide panel that is totally useless. So are you now recutting your panels? Are you redrawing it if it doesn't work? Are you cutting it up into 3 panels that you can arrange vertically? And the answer probably is no for a lot of people. And if that's the case, now you're sort of reading this thing that was shoehorned. Do you point at something, Dan? that was shoehorned into a different app. So it was built for print, and now I'm just sort of putting it on this digital thing. That's not going to produce the best results.
Yeah, I mean, I go the frame by frame thing too. It's like something. It's an increased cost and an increased time to market that, to me, doesn't provide a lot of value. Like I would rather see them bring the cost of digital comics down, because this is going to get controversial too. Okay. Right. Because I feel like there is a difference between the digital reading market and the paper person who wants the comic in print, and that they don't have to be competitive against each other. Even if the price point were different, even if the price were lower, and even if you sold more digital comics than you did paper, there's room for both, because you would be exposing the people to comics, and the hardcorest of them, the ones that really get into it, are going to seek it out in print, because that's the best format. No doubt about it. I got opinions. It's the best, right? There's trade-offs, but it's the best.
Here's my motion comic rebuttal. Again, I think it depends on the comic. You know, are you putting effort into making that work somehow? So there's a comic I love called Thunderpaws, and it's just a digital comic. It's been going for years and years. It's actually kind of old at this point, but there would be like animated GIFs of, say, rain in the background. You know, I'm sure you've seen comics this way. Yeah. That description totally undersells, you know, the quality of how it's executed. But if executed well, it can be very entertaining. And again, it's built for the screen.
Yeah. No doubt about that. No doubt about that.
The problem is most people aren't putting that effort in. You know, they're just making this thing and dumping it out and trying to get paid or whatever, and not really worried about it. You know, we call it jobbing, where it's just like it seems like the person making it doesn't care, right, or they're inept. You know, I had a friend that used to call it liar or stupid. Neither one of them's a good solution. You know what I mean? So like you look at this stuff and it looks like it was half-assed done quickly. Nobody cared. And it's like, that's probably all that it doesn't really matter what the answer is. If it's a lousy comic, it doesn't help anybody.
Well, that's what I mean. But I just mean the motion part of it. Like you're saying, the distinction, I think, between what you just said and what I'm saying is that was an artistic decision made by the creator.
Very much so.
Now, when you take somebody's comic and you decide to chop it up and show the panels in this order and that order and this and whatever, you're now making aesthetic decisions about how that thing is consumed that maybe the artist didn't intend or whatever, and definitely drastically alters it. It's sort of the difference between, like, I don't know, like an artisanal chipped ham sandwich, you know, and one that you might just get like at a deli, so, you know, just like at a Subway sandwich store. You know what I mean? I'm talking about maybe something more like from the Primati brothers. You know what I mean? Where you would go and you might get a chipped ham sandwich. You see where I'm going with this? All right, digital. I think we played out digital. I agree with you, man. It's a mixed bag on digital.
I'll give you one more angle on digital, Dan. We haven't quite played it out yet. I believe like more and more it's up to the consumer, the reader, how they want to interact with this stuff. And with that in mind, it's like, I'll give you another Octobriana 1976 example. I am creating a digital version of the story because that fits well with Kickstarter, but it's not the way the story was built and conceived of. And I believe I'm going to end up with 3 digital versions of it. And if you buy any level of Octobriana 1976, you're going to get all 3 of them. So you can decide which one you prefer, which one looks the best to you. And I think that more and more, this is going to be the future of how consumers get the media that they get. What do they want to watch it on? You know, David Lynch may hate movies on your iPhone, but we're now in an age where you get to decide if you want to watch the movie on your iPhone or on your big plasma screen, or, you know, in some abandoned movie theater, maybe. But more and more, it's up to, you know, everything's on demand. It's all available everywhere all the time. And it's really up to the consumer as to like where they want to go. And one thing I've learned from making comics, my comics readers and fans are really smart. Like I want to give them the formats that I possibly can, and they can choose the one they want. You know, you talked about us being like on YouTube and being on different social media, and we also do a podcast, because if you want to listen to our show in your commute and you're not watching it, that's up to you. You know, I want you to listen, I want you to watch it, and I want it to work well for you. So I think we're moving in that direction. And if publishers or whomever does not accommodate that, I think you're going to be left behind. You know, if somebody really wants to read something on their iPad and it's not available on an iPad, they're going to find something else to read on their iPad. They're not going to put the iPad down in the middle of the night and go look for a 24-hour library or store.
You're exactly right. You're coming at it from the multi-channel world that we live in that I've been talking about. Publishers figured that out a decade or so, or in the past decade or so. They got that mostly figured out. They know they got to be in digital, they got to be in print, they got to be in the bookstores, they got to be in comic shops. It's the retailers who, in my opinion, have not quite grasped that their customers are all online now. It's not like, what is this internet thing? It's like CB radio. When's it going to take off, dude? That's what our series Comic Shop 2.0 is all about on this channel. We're doing a continuing series where we just talk about exactly what you and me are talking about, the comic shop of the future. And while I got you here on camera, would you be willing to sit in on one of those panels one day and talk the kind of stuff you're talking with some other retailers and mix it up and say your opinion?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I watch your streams that are industry based for this reason, because it is a different insight. Like I said, I don't know anything about retail. I don't know anything really about distribution. So yeah, I'm happy that you're doing that, and I'm happy to participate any way I can.
Oh man, thanks. That's super awesome. Because there's a lot of blood I think that's going to be spilled in this industry, right? And like somebody's going to have to, like, this economy, what's going on in the economy in general and in comics specifically, there's going to be blood spilled. We're going to have to wipe that blood up. We're going to need a towel, and that towel, it's going to be terrible. It's really going to be a terrible towel.
This is my favorite one so far.
So, but man, Jim, I could talk to you all day about comics. What I want to talk, I'm going to put you on the spot for one thing though. Are you back at the comeback, dude? Are you back in the comeback? Can Cartoon Kayfabe, can you cut a promo that says Cartoon Kayfabe is back in the comeback?
Tell me what backing the comeback looks like. Oh
man. Back in the comeback means letting everybody out there know that comic stores are back in business, that comics, while there was all these news stories out there saying comics are doomed, the stores are shutting down, COVID is the death blow of the comic store, okay? Back in the Comeback is an industry-wide campaign, right? It's fronted by Steve Geppi, but I don't know, man. If you watch those streams with Geppi, he's not coming at it from a diamond, has to dominate forever perspective. He's in it for the love, just like anybody else in the industry. So he's pushing this thing, man. And I'm trying to help. He did me a favor coming onto my channel, but man, I got to do a favor to the whole comic book industry and say, we need comic shops. And it's all about just say awareness. And for my mind, it boils down to this point: make comic shops your first stop for comics when you want a comic.
Well, I guess I am doing that. I certainly have been sharing every comic shop announcement that I've seen. I am not very comfortable joining groups that I have no control over.
Right.
I appreciate that Diamond is up and running, and I hope it stays that way. But I don't know Steve Geppi. I'm not comfortable speaking to his motivations for anything beyond, a successful business.
It's an industry-wide thing that other people are supporting. Different publishers and stuff are getting behind. And I'm just saying, dude, I don't care about hashtags or ice bucket challenges or any of that nonsense. I care about getting people to support their local comic book shops.
Yes.
So to me, that's what Back to Comeback is.
I am 100% in favor of support your local comic shop. And if you're a comic shop that crosses my path, I am going to put that message through whatever size megaphone I happen to possess. So yes, please back your comic shops. Please go visit them, drag friends along, buy gifts there. I can't say enough about them. I can't remember now, Dan, what we've talked about on air and off air, but you mentioned in Plain Jane's meeting your tribe and finding your tribe in comic shops. It's the same thing to me. I met Ed Piscor at a comic shop because when I first started out, I knew one other cartoonist across town. We would meet every Wednesday at the comic shop. And I can't tell you how many other cartoonists I know who have the same story. They met their fellow creators at those comic shops. So I love comic shops. They are where I feel at home, and I hope they outlive me. So yes, please, everyone, do support them in every way that you can.
All right. So Jim's back in the comeback. You heard it. You heard it right here. Man, he's back in the comeback. So speaking of Ed Piscor, by the way, I got to get him in here because I just read WYSIWYG for the first time. I just finished it literally this morning. Okay. The complete hardcover from Top Shelf.
It's a beautiful book. Talking about book as object. That's a beautiful book.
Wonderful. And as a dude who's deeply into computers, like, I don't know, in my day job, I do some stuff with computers, and I've been into that scene, and I've been teaching myself to pick locks and how to do stuff with computers for my entire life. And somehow I missed that comic when it was being serialized on Boing Boing and when it came out until now. And I go like, oh man, I missed the boat big time, not loving that thing. So please, hopefully you could encourage Ed to come on here and we'll talk about his comics too soon.
I will let him know your feelings on that. You know what though, Dan, that's the best example that I've heard. Whenever you say like a retailer says, oh, everybody back this guy's book on Kickstarter. Well, here you are, you love the subject, you like the cartoonist, and yet it's 10 years after it was published before you find it. Yep. There is no, like, I don't know what something has to sell in order to actually saturate people's interest in it, So I think that's a wrong attitude that a lot of people have. And I've heard cartoonists express it. I've heard publishers express it. I've heard cartoonists who they have their print run of 2,000 books sell out. And instead of demanding the publisher put that next print run together, they kind of go, well, everybody that wanted one got one. Are you kidding? 2,000 people's not any, that's nothing. That's literally nothing in the face of the population. But people have that attitude. And it's like, you're a great example, man. That book should have crossed your path for a decade. And it just finally does.
Absolutely. And dude, I was a Boing Boing daily reader when that thing was coming out too. And I somehow it glossed over, somehow it went by me. Somehow, I knew of it from that. And I sort of saw the trappings of stuff that I would be interested in, but not till I read it do I go, man, this is a guy who researched this stuff to the nth degree, but just sprinkled it in as little references and stuff that would be, unless you really know the story of Kevin Mitnick and the real stuff that went down, you can't appreciate the details. Anyway, this is not about Ed Piscourt. This is about Jim Rugg. And Jim, I think it's time, if you don't mind, because I saw the comments are blowing up. Okay.
All right.
You can't see them yet, but I'm going to turn those on so that you can see them. And then we're going to answer some of them. I guarantee you there's going to be stuff about Dan being the comeback shill, which I proudly am. I'm going to turn on your viewer comments, and now you should be able to see them there. All right. And I haven't been looking at them either because our new policy on this channel is to talk when we talk and then come into the viewer comments section. Right. So let's go now to some viewer comments. And Jim, you can look through there. If you see any that you particularly want to answer, feel free to let me know. I'm going to just sort of browse through for a second.
Draw my attention to any that speak to you, Dan. It's
all right.
This is one of the harder things of live videos is keeping up with the chat while also talking.
Right. That's why I don't like to show it during the conversation, right? So feel free to scroll through there. All right. I'm going to start with this guy for a second, and I think it's a reasonable question. Why do retailers even have to be included in a conversation about crowdfunding? Great question, I guess. I think the answer, Jim, what do you think? Do you think that it should be either or? Do you think retailers should just say there's crowdfunding and there's retail and never the twain shall meet?
I think it's like everything else. It's individual. They don't have to be included. There's no law or rule about it. I want to include them. Retailers are really important and special to me. So personally, I want to include them in that conversation, but I don't think anybody owes anybody anything. It's really up to the person.
Yeah.
And vice versa. If a retailer chooses not to carry my book for any reason, that's up to them too. So, again, I personally love comic shops. I want my comics in comic shops. So that's why I would want to include retailers in my crowdfund.
Okay. So let's talk about this for a second. I kind of glossed this over because we talked about the early Street Angel days, but oh man. And I had the greatest thing too, I was going to say, because you decided you look back at the stuff you've done in the past and you said, hey, Street Angel, I'll bet you now is a good time to bring that. It might be a commercially viable character that makes Street Angel your buddy Bradley from Neat Stuff, right? Like you made a kind of commercially minded decision based on some earlier stuff. Talk about that for a second and tell me how many pages are in this thing.
Okay, so
how many are available?
All right. So what I think you're referring to is my first comic was Street Angel, a black and white indie book, 5 issues, published by SLG, and then republished in a nice hardcover by Ad House Books in 2014 or 2013. I can't remember the year. Whenever that hardcover came out, because the book had been out of print for about 10 years, I had to go through all of it to put it back together. And I was like, Oh man, I like, I still like this character. It's a very fun character for me because she's super dynamic. And what had happened is I've become a better cartoonist in the 10 years since I did Street Angels. So I went to Comic-Con that year as a guest, and I met with Eric Stevenson at Image Comics, and I pitched him a few different ideas, and he knew of my work from the past and stuff. And Street Angel was one of the ideas, was like, fans have been asking me to bring her back. And so it was like, well, maybe a Street Angel book at Image would work. It's kind of it's a superhero, but it's an offbeat superhero. That could be really cool. And Eric Stevenson said yes. And so then I did a series of Street Angel graphic novels, these big oversized hardcovers. Think of like a picture book, if you're thinking in terms of format. And I probably have a couple handy here that I can hold up. So they were published because what happened is each Street Angel story, you have to do some advanced stories for Image before they publish any. And they were completely self-contained stories, ranging from, say, 24 to 40 pages. And Stevenson liked them. And I said, well, maybe we'll just publish them as one-shots. And he said, do you want to try this format? It was based on a European album art, comics album. So that's what we did. And we published 5 of those. We published a free comic book day issue that was all drawn digitally on my iPad. And then we put out a collection of that, Street Angel, The Deadliest Girl Alive. And that collection is, I think, 208 pages, although I might be wrong on the page count, but it's all comics, the collection. The hardcover books have extra stuff and a lot of design indulgences. Each one sort of follows a concept with the story, but then the collection is just all comics. It's like all but, I don't know, 8 pages are comics. Very
well, not to derail, but it's my show, so I get to do that. But dude, do you have that Nemo book that you got the Eisner for? Because I didn't even know that book existed either. Speaking of books that don't exist, and it's telling me that I've got the Sunday Press Nemo books. You know what I mean? I love that format, and I love McKay, and then you're telling me there's Peter Bagg doing Winsor McKay full. So I went to Amazon right away because I'm like, I know I can't find that locally. I know. And there's 2 copies left on Amazon, or I should say there's 1 copy left on Amazon.
Well done, Dan.
Because I dropped $189 that it cost for that book, and I can't wait for that. Talk about that for a second, if you will.
Yes. So I won the Eisner for design for that book. As I said, my background's in design. And what happened is it came up at a time when I was super busy, but I love all these formats and, print. And so these guys that were making this book were doing like the Sunday Press books, which reprint the original Little Nemo at actual size, like 22 by 18 inches or something, massive. And so they asked me if I wanted to art direct this book. And I had to, because when else am I ever going to work on a canvas that size?
Right.
And I got to do some really cool stuff, like Todd Klein designed the logo. And so as I'm putting together the title page, the Todd Klein logo, I have to step back to show this, is like this wide. And in my mind, I'm like, this is going to be the biggest anybody ever sees Todd Klein's letters. And I get to be responsible for making them this huge size. And really, because he's I love lettering. He's one of the best letterers ever.
He's a man of letters.
Exactly. And so it's just it's an anthology where everybody gets to do a Little Nemo strip. The concept of Little Nemo, one of the all-time great comic strips, is Nemo falls asleep in panel 1 and dreams. And then in the last panel, wakes up from the dream. And so it's kind of a great concept. It's a perfect launching point for an anthology. And they got all kinds of artists in it, many of whom I will forget now because it's been several years. But it is a who's who of great cartoonists.
Oh, yeah. I was looking at the names and I can't even. And then it's done by Gerhard. And I'm assuming that's the Gerhard we know from Cerebus, right? Yes. I don't know that I've ever seen anything by him besides Cerebus. So I go, that's amazing. I can't wait to see it.
You're going to have fun with it.
Is he doing pages in that too? Like,
he does a page. Like most people do a page. Some people do a couple pages, but mostly it's like one artist, one page. And there's got to be, I don't know, 150 artists or something in it. But it's that, it's just beautiful. The production was stunning. I don't know how many places produce those books. Like there's one press that I know does some of them, but I think they were printed the same place as the Sunday Press books, because I think they even have to be partially hand bound because of their size and weight. So it's a beautiful object. And I got to do some fun stuff with it in terms of design, referencing old Nemo strips, and then also bringing in all of the new materials. There's intros and extra material like that. And I did the covers. And I'm so happy with them because the front cover is like the big moon, it's this very graphic, big circle white moon. And you see the bed and it's empty because, of course, he's off in slumberland. And then whenever you get to the back cover, it's the New York, city building tops, and the sun is just coming up for dawn. And it's the same size sun in circle and sphere as the moon on the back, but it's like inverted 180 degrees. So you get like, the back cover is like the day is starting, the front cover is the night. And the contents, of course, is that.
Like that kind of stuff. I love that kind of stuff. And like, you might have sweated and thought about that and done it. And like maybe 80% of the people who read it and are into it might not have ever even put that together or noticed it. And
really good design, I think, is often invisible. Same with really good lettering. Like if you do everything right in a comic book, if you do everything right, what you remember is some great story, or great characters. And I think it's a weird concept, but even if you're a great artist, but the art is so good and so detailed that it stops you as a reader, in a weird way, that's a comic breakdown.
All right, I got a question here. Rugg, when you go for a run, because I know you're into running, man, you ever do a pub crawl with comic book shops, but more healthy? You get calisthenics and blah, blah, blah. All right, whatever, running. Talk about running for a second. I know that's a big part of who you are. You put it on your website. You're into running.
Yeah, I do like running. I did a marathon a couple years ago, and to like motivate myself, I would do comics about every single training session and post them. So it was like this positive peer pressure of like, well, now I've kind of got to stick with it and go through it. So I do like it. I think exercise is really important, for a million reasons. There are 2 comic shops. I live in a suburb, but there are 2 comic shops within running distance of where I live. I don't know that I've ever actually run to one to shop. But it's not inconceivable. So it has crossed my path. And whenever I ran the marathon, I ran by a couple of comic shops that I frequently visit. I think 3 actually in the path of the Pittsburgh Marathon. So yeah, comics and running, man, they're definitely intertwined in my life.
Okay, let me go deep cut here. Wait a minute. You into Concrete and Paul Chadwick?
Yes.
Okay. Remember the Sky of Heads?
I don't.
Okay, remember he would do the little backup series of 1-page strips called Sky of Heads, and it was about a TV show that Concrete would watch. And it was just these heads floating in outer space, and they would come and talk to each other, and they would tell stories to each other because that's all they had in this universe, right? And they would tell the story of their life and their death. And he did a series of these 1-page strips. And there was one about running and the endorphins of running. And I don't know, I'm just rabbit hole because this is my show. And I wanted to talk about and Paul Chadwick for a second.
My Concrete Paul Chadwick stuff, I have 2. I don't remember the Talking Head show, though it's funny to think of it in that phrase. But I remember he would do backups that were like nightmare stories. And one of them, I think it was in the first Legend Concrete miniseries. Like the first one was waking up in the morning and being like paralyzed in your bed. And man, I still think about like that. I read it at the right time where it is like still in my head, very much so. And the other
100 horrors or something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Nightmarish kind of psychological stuff. At least that particular strip was. And then the other piece is he did an Earth Day special, and it has like a 20-something page Mobius wordless strip in color. Yeah. So that is one I have pulled out of a lot of quarter and dollar boxes and then just give to people. If you're looking for Mobius and if you're diving through those 50-cent boxes, that Concrete Earth Day special is one to pull out if you come across it.
And I mean, Concrete is one of those ones that I want to see you guys talk about on your channel so much because it was an amazing comic for its day. It was ahead of its time in so many ways. When you think about it, there was like body horror issues in it, as well as, the psychology of this gentle guy trapped in the giant and everything else. And the sci-fi trope of the aliens and stuff was just sort of treated as like, that's it's like classic sci-fi where there's only one thing that's not real world about this world. Made that an amazing book to me. Like that was my gateway drug. I was telling Gary Roth this, in one of our conversations on this channel. I was telling him that was my gateway drug to hate and to Peter Bagg and to the Fantagraphics catalog was reading Dark Horse Presents and just seeing comics could tell these kind of different, totally outside of what Marvel and DC were, but still be gripping and amazing. And
There's a lineage of those comics that have like a little bit of a superhero element, something, something physical, supernatural. I feel like early Mike Allred Madman would be one of those. Even like the Jam and some of Matt Wagner stuff, where it was kind of like there was just some element, but it was also, there was more of a realistic or an emphasis on the realism of the world around that super characteristic. Concrete's pretty interesting in a lot of ways, certainly for that reason. I like the whole origin of like aliens putting him in that body, just to have the aliens in there, which again is the supernatural piece that's not a huge part of the story. It's not like he's going through the cosmos on a surfboard or something tracking them down.
Right. Well, but I mean, they visited the inside of the ship and you saw all the crazy stuff. But what I loved about that was a flashback in like issue 4 or something. And before that, he was just appearing in these stories in Dark Horse Presents. And he even had a few issues where it was like, who is this guy? There's something, nobody knows what he is. And it was the slow reveal in flashback form to his friends. It just made me think, when they tried to adapt Concrete, they tried to go like the origin story. Let's have the aliens capture him and do all this. And I go, that would never work. Like, Concrete is not a movie. It's a TV series. It's a Netflix show that unfolds slowly and but realistically, but has these epic moments of high drama, like on the ocean or at the top of the Himalayas. But then it gets into the realities of this gentle speechwriter trapped. Guys, am I babbling so much when I've got Jim Rugg, world famous cartoonist here? I'm sorry.
It surprises me that Concrete does not exist as a TV or movie, because it does lend itself. And those points, like him swimming across the ocean or climbing through the Himalayas, great visuals. Like, it seems like it would almost translate itself to this other media. And forever, it'd be one thing if Chadwick didn't want to do that, but it was forever in development. Like, you would always see it in those, whatever comic book magazines would have updates on, what's coming to the screen. It feels like Concrete was always in development. So,
dude, and there's even videos you can look on YouTube, and there's test footage of Concrete in the worst CG footage you've ever seen. It looks horrible. But that's where I go, it was so ahead of its time. It wasn't ready to adapt. Effects weren't there.
It would be seamless now,
It would be perfect. So when I have Mike Richardson in here, and I'm working on a solo Mike Richardson interview like this, I'm going to go so deep on Concrete and Paul Chadwick. He's going to be sick of hearing about it. If everybody else watching this isn't already sick of hearing about Concrete, all right? Sorry. Jim, I've taken so much of your time. You've been so generous, and your spirit of infectious enthusiasm for comics, man, is what really inspired me on YouTube. Like, I was doing YouTube before I saw Cartoonist Kayfabe. You probably started way before me, or I don't even know what year you started. When did you start that channel?
We started in October 2018. So it's not been that long, about a year and a half.
Okay, so you started maybe a few months before me, and then my show was a reaction to the garbage shows that I see on. And no offense to anybody out there on YouTube.
Garbage. Calling stuff garbage isn't offensive.
No offense to you people who work super hard on garbage, but like, I can't stand. I'm not going to name any specific shows, but there's just a lot of stuff out there that's aimed at an angle that just wasn't my cup of tea. That's all. And I looked at things from a different angle, and I'm trying to just be pro comics and whatever. And that's what I got out of yours. And watching your show was like getting to talk with one of my close buddies who's really deep into comics in a way that I could never have with anybody else in the universe. So I thank you for that. My last bit here is, I've got my list right here. This is my Cartoonist Kayfabe dream interview list. Okay.
All right. You know what, Dan, before you do that, because that's a great ending.
Yeah.
Somebody asked me about future goals, stretch goals for Octobriana. Can I just run through a couple, because I'm still working these things out?
You want me to pull the stretch goals up on the screen while you talk about them?
No, you don't have to. I'm just starting to add stretch goals. So the first one that I'm doing is coming up soon, hopefully. It's 60K, and it's going to be the checklist that I've been talking about. This will involve both real life history of Octobriana and what exists in newspaper articles. It was on the front page of the Telegraph in London when it was published. So, it has a really interesting history in that regard to other media. And then also the comics checklist of where it's appeared, because it's been in a lot of comics. So I'm doing some legwork, talking to people like Paul Gravett and getting information. And it's basically going to be, I think this character should be a little more well-known. This will be a document that if you're interested in Octobriana, it will have a lot of information about her. This includes the Freedom of Information Act requests. So anything I find from the FBI or the CIA will also go into this document.
So Jim, this is my question. And why I forgot to ask this, because when I look up your thing on Kickstarter, it's not called Octobriana. The project that on Kickstarter is called Fluorescent, Blacklight, Outlaw comic book, right?
Yes.
So why is the name Octobriana not in it? I don't understand.
Because I didn't think it would mean much to people. I was trying to figure out, how do you sum this up to people that are interested in printed matter, interested in comic books, and Octobriana is not that well known. It's if I say that to my wife, she has no idea. If I say Blacklight or comic book, she knows both of those words. Okay. So I don't know if it was the right answer, but that was my thinking behind it.
Dude, the fact that you have a commercially minded thinking behind what you chose, that is the right answer, Jim. Because you don't know what the right one is. Everybody's throwing stuff to the wall. I think that people who know Octobriana might search for Octobriana, and it'll come up in a search engine this way, and they'll see Blacklight comic book. So great move.
Some other stretch goals that I'm planning is I may do some sort of a hardcover version that'll have some extra pages. That's a lot of plates that are spinning. So I'm still working on that and trying to get a quote from the printer and trying to get it in time to make that work. I may do another Blacklight screen print. I have an image that's pretty popular that I think would look amazing as a Blacklight screen print. And so for a stretch goal, what I might do is fold that into the sets of screen prints. If somebody buys the set, this will be kind of the extra. I'm planning to do like a signed black and white print that'll just go with every single copy of the book that is sold. And there'll probably be a bunch of extra stuff that's not really a stretch goal, like stickers and probably a postcard, something like that. So right now, that's where it stands.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
How about a handheld Blacklight thing?
I have heard that one.
That has Octobriana logo or something on it. Dude, you can make that happen, Jim.
That's pretty good. That is something that's crossed my path, so I'm looking into it a little bit too.
Did you ever read the Warren Ellis comic that came with the UV flashlight?
No, I haven't.
So it was the dialogue, and there was stuff printed in invisible ink in the comic that you could read it without it, and it told a story. And then you shine this little flashlight at it, and the invisible subtext appears.
You're going to kayfabe affect this book before I get a copy, Dan. You've said enough.
Okay. Mum's the word. So wait a minute. Speaking of kayfabe, let's go back to my list.
Yes, let's hear it.
And let's hear out there from the commenters too. Who do you want to see on Cartoonist Kayfabe? Let's pull some of those up. But for me, you just recently ticked off somebody who was probably like way, way up at the top of the list of who I wanted to hear you guys talk to because of your angle. And that was Mark Millar or Miller.
I think Miller.
Okay.
That's what we were calling him. So I hope that's correct.
I know, right? But so to me, an amazing guy in a few ways, because the whole Ultimates thing hit right when I bought my comic book store. Joe Quesada was working on Marvel Knights, an imprint at Marvel. Mm-hmm. And I read those comics and I went, okay, Marvel before was garbage. I had stopped reading all mainstream stuff. And suddenly these things were coming out, and he was making some choices of artists and writers and stuff. Brian Bendis was coming in and writing Daredevil and stuff like that. And I'm going now. And then the Spider-Man movie's coming out. I go, this is a time for comics. I'm going to try it now. And that era, though, of 2001 or whatever to right out before I left, 2008, was, in my mind, the second greatest era of Marvel Comics after Stan and Jack and the classic era. I don't know how you feel about that, or if you have
That's
anything.
Interesting.
Not that there wasn't garbage coming out, but the Ultimates by itself, if that's the only thing that came out of it, that was the roadmap for what is the MCU and all the movies that came after it.
I agree with you. It's a really interesting time period. I mean, Grant Morrison on X-Men was kind of cool. And several of the other stories Mark Miller wrote, very iconic, from Civil War to Old Man Logan. So like that whole era, I think Joe Quesada really did a great job of writing the ship at that time and bringing in interesting creators.
Marvel Max Did you read any of the Marvel Max, the Richard Corbin banner?
Loved all the
series?
Richard Corbin stuff. Cage.
2 Peter Bagg produced Marvel comics that came out in that. The Strange Adventure stuff. It's got James Kochalka in there and all these other indie cartoonists of the era. You're in there too?
I'm in there a couple times because my story, the story was you can do whatever you want, you know?
Yeah.
So I did a story. It made it into the Society of Illustrators annual. It was this big deal. I was super excited about it. And then they wouldn't run it. And so I had to do a second story.
Okay. I'm going to keep going through my list because there's suggestions coming up.
The other era of Marvel Comics that I was going to say is the Jim Shooter stuff. Like there's a really strong time period with Jim Shooter.
True.
Depending on when you read comics, is after him, you know, like Tom DeFalco era. That's whenever McFarlane was doing Spider-Man, Jim Lee was doing X-Men, and Rob Liefeld was doing X-Force. So there's a couple pockets in there where there are these heights. Agreed. Jim Shooter is Frank Miller Daredevil and Chris Claremont John Byrne X-Men. Like that's a good run.
As well. I don't want to discount that. I'm kind of wrong to say it, but what I meant is editorially, like
it was strong. Like, I agree with you.
Shooter era was about commercial abilities of comics, and he did some really amazing stuff, and he had an eye for talent as well. That I guess I would put that in there too. I would say there's the Lee Kirby era, the Shooter era, and the Quesada era. To me, they're all like contenders. Anyway, on my list also, Chris Claremont, of course, who you just dropped the interview with, and I'm sure people now instead of this. Thanks a lot. Rick Veitch, dude. Speaking of Dream Comics, I haven't watched all your interviews yet because I'm just behind in life, let alone my comics.
We all are.
But dude, Rare Bit Fiends. Did you talk a lot about Rare Bit Fiends?
Not enough. We really didn't talk enough about it. You know, his career is vast. Like he did everything everywhere, and it's very cursory, our conversation, because we could have talked on any one of several of his works, including Rare Bit Fiends.
To me, that's the ultimate Rick Veitch work. I don't think that's the pinnacle of, and that's saying a lot because of how many amazing things he's been a co-creator or whatever. But that was the one where it was like his vision, he was publishing it.
It was his dream comic.
Dreams, right? It was literally his dreams come true, manifest in reality. Like that is amazing. You talked to Bissett too, I think. And I hope you went
4 hours.
Yeah, you went deep into Tyrant. I would hope.
Yeah,
I really want to, because I got to go back. I haven't watched them all. Man, this is where I got to say, go back, give us some bite-sized clips of the gem moments too, and you'll get a lot of views coming.
You know, you're right about that. It's where we could use an intern to kind of go through and cut this stuff up into different ways. Even cutting like in terms of topics, because so many people overlap in topics. You know, but I would highly recommend the Bissett interview if you're a fan of comics history, because he's another guy like Rick Veitch that was there for so much stuff. You know, he did mainstream work. He worked with Alan Moore. He's at Image, early in Image. He's around Tundra. He self-publishes in the self-publishing boom. Like, yeah, both of those guys, man. Everybody we've talked to, I like. So I you know. Totally.
So I'm going to just rattle off this list.
Yeah, keep going.
Who you guys talk to? So McFarlane, you talk to. Bill Willingham. If you're doing writers, get Willingham, please, and talk a lot about elementals, please. Just scratch my elementals itch. Speaking of Jim Shooter, get Jim Shooter in there and just let him talk his head off. And Paul Levitz, get Paul Levitz in there and talk about DC Comics and everything he's been involved in. Get Mike Richardson, get Michael Golden, please. And I'm going to drop a name I don't even know. You've mentioned his comics before. And Ed Piskor said, I don't even know if these really qualify as comics. I'm going to ask how much you know about Elliot R. Brown.
I don't know anything about Elliot R. Brown. Tell me about him.
Yes, you know a lot more than you think about Elliot R. Brown, my friend, because Elliot R. Brown is known as Mr. Technical, okay? He was the guy, originally he worked at Marvel in the bullpen in the 80s and that Shooter era. He was the guy who did all the photo stats and did all the behind-the-scenes production work that you are so deep into.
I'm on board.
Wait a minute. He's also the guy who drew all of the diagrams of the weapons and the buildings in Marvel. Okay. He's also the guy who did all of the Marvel photo covers. Every Marvel photo cover you've ever seen was done by Elliot R. Brown. And he's even in that one with Spider-Man, where the photographer is taking the picture of Spider-Man with his mask. He's the photographer in that. Okay. He's also the creator of the Iron Manual and the Punisher Armory. Okay.
One of the weirdest things Marvel's ever published, and just grows weirder and weirder by the day. I bought a lot of those off of the spinner rack.
It is an amazing thing. It is a look inside the mind of a psychopath, like from a psychotic point of view, but brings
unironically,
dude. And there's moments of real characterization and passion in that. Dude, he drew the Baxter Building. He could tell you about his epic drawings of the Baxter Building and how he had to set up by hand these hand things to get the perspective right because it was so gigantic. I did a long interview with the guy, okay? But I cannot do justice to any of that production value type stuff. So please let me forward you an email address to him.
Please
and consider
do.
talking to the guy.
Yeah, I'd be very interested to talk to him.
He deserves an Art of Elliot R. Brown, Mr. Technical book, because that stuff is so iconic. Every Quinjet picture, every Spider-Man's web shooters, every Spider-Man's camera with the little motor in it. Dude, he researched and wrote Spitfire and the Troubleshooters for Marvel's New Universe, was the creator of that. And
I don't know how much time we'll spend on that one.
No, wait a minute. His concept, though, was a grounded Iron Man. It was using all technology that was available of the day. Like conceptually, it was really interesting. Execution-wise, could have gone. The whole New Universe could have gone in a different way, right? But whatever. We're not going to talk about that. That's my list. Oh, wait a minute. No, obviously you want Alan Moore. Obviously, you're trying like crazy behind the scenes to get Alan Moore to talk on your show, right?
We're doing magic spells and stuff behind the scenes.
Yeah, incantations, you're sacrificing animal. Okay, good. Eddie Campbell, gotta put feelers out to Eddie.
Personally, he's a huge guy for me personally. Like the Alec comics, his autobio stuff, really kind of expanded my mind at a time whenever I was starting to look in that direction and seeing even what he would do with duotone. He was a guy that drew things stylistically that fit the tone of the story, where like he's adapting his style. Good example for everybody would be From Hell, is where you can see where it looks like these old engravings and is like, how could From Hell even work in any other style? You know, like it's such a perfect style. But he was one of those guys that I started to see style as a storytelling tool because of Eddie Campbell. Big fan.
Well, and there's the new colorized version of From Hell, colored by Campbell, coming out that I've just been waiting for. I'm going to wait for the collective because that's my all-time favorite Alan Moore, and maybe my all-time favorite graphic novel is From Hell. So wait a minute, that's my list. Robert Kirkman too. Got to get Robert Kirkman, man. Talk about like a commercially minded guy who's deep into comics, and you guys would like. I think would be a really excellent interview. Other names that came up here. Ed Brubaker, for sure. The most underrated guy of that era of Marvel. Talk about Ed Brubaker for a second, too, and his indie roots.
That's the thing that I don't know. You know, like he has these two distinct bodies of work and as an indie guy, writing and drawing. So plus, you know, like a lover of genre, which I happen to love genre for probably a lot of the same reasons. So yeah, he would be a great guy to talk craft with, I think, as well, to really break down craft, because I mean, that guy's almost like a machine in you know, his production and his productivity and stuff.
Okay, how about John Byrne, man? John Byrne is a towering figure in comics. There's no other way to say it, I think.
I agree with you, but has a certain reputation, John Byrne does.
Yes.
One of my few bad encounters with the pro happened with John Byrne whenever I was a kid. Now, I'll tell this story because I have no hard feelings about it. But one of the first comic shows I ever went to, I had made an ash can, you know, a mini comic. I was in high school, but I had my driver's license and I drove to Ohio to go to Mid Ohio Con. And John Byrne was doing Next Men at the time. And it was like my favorite comic book. So he was the guy I wanted to give my mini comic to.
Me too. Great comic, right?
I loved it. But I go up to him and I'm like, oh man, I love Next Men. And he says to me, he's like, that last issue's, I finished it on time. I sent it in. There was a delay, but for the last issue of that series, and I was seeing him before the last issue was out, and I was just there to tell him how much I loved the book. I figured it would come out sooner or later. So as soon as I say I love Next Men, he's like goes into this kind of pretty serious rant about he finished the book on time. It's not his fault. It's late, and it's like, all right, man. And then I pull out my shitty little mini comic that's so bad, and hand it to him. And he's like, look, I'm not going to take this on the plane. Gave it back to me. And, it was a bad experience. In hindsight, it's not too bad. But to me, like, I had built up this moment of like, I'm going to talk to John. I'm going to talk to this guy that I love his work. And he just wasn't having it. It might have been the end of the day too. Who knows? But I remember thinking afterwards, I admire the honesty. I know, like usually you would you think, oh, just take it, right? Throw it in the garbage can behind you or whatever once I walk away. But hey, he was being honest with me. So
give him that, right? You're just another in a long line of burn victims.
Exactly. And knowing I was a burn victim going into it should have told me everything I needed to know. A little bit of that's on me.
Kevin Eastman. Did you do Kevin Eastman?
Haven't done Kevin Eastman. Would love to. So much history with Kevin Eastman. We've talked about the Turtles a lot. We did the Kevin Eastman Comics Journal interview. Might have been I think Tom McFarlane Comics Journal was our first one. We've done a couple of these comics journals where we go through the issue and we really kind of talk through the interview or the articles. Kevin Eastman's is legendary because it's about Tundra. It happened several years after Tundra. And Tundra lost millions of dollars. It is legendary because it's one of the few indie comics companies that had a big pot of money and put that pot in the middle. And legendary figure for a lot of reasons, obviously the Turtles, but Tundra has its own legend, and it's amazing. Like the Crow comes out of Tundra, at least the collected edition, and around the time of the Crow movie comes out of Tundra. But it was right. It starts in Steve Bissett's Taboo, which was published several issues through Tundra. So It goes through there. I think they might have done the collected. They were doing like a couple chapters in a 48-page square bound. That was Tundra. Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, the first printing is Tundra. So when he gets rid of Tundra, it's not necessarily because he doesn't have these books. It's just fascinating. Tundra is one of the most fascinating bits of comics history, especially indie comics history, and would love to talk to him about all of this stuff.
I'm just gonna flash names, man, because we got one of the sharper audiences in comics. Here's people we want to see.
Ann Nocenti. I'm a big Ann Nocenti fan. I'd be interested in talking to her. She was an editor for a while, in addition to writing some really unique comics. Like her run on Daredevil with John Romita Jr. and Al Williamson is one of my high points in comics. And it's a really different run, like her voice is different than most of the writers that I've read at Marvel. So I'd like to talk to her.
And I can't believe I didn't put Frank Miller on my list too.
Of course.
What's the deal? You're obviously working on that, I would hope.
I want to talk to everybody in comics. There's very few people and Ed talked about it recently. We go to conventions and you end up at dinners with who knows who you end up with. And you almost triangulate what your interests are very quickly. A couple of questions and you're in, like you're locked in with these people. There's so much overlap with creators. So almost any creator that wants to show up is probably somebody I can learn from.
Okay.
Mike Allred, love Mike Allred. Mike Allred, man, I don't know how many what I should be telling on this show or not, Dan. I was almost out of comics at one point, and Mike Allred connected me to somebody, Courtney Taylor from the Dandy Warhols, who did One Model Nation at Image Comics. And this was around like 2008, 2009, when the economy had kind of tanked and things were really tough for me comics-wise. One day out of the blue, Mike Allred called me to basically connect me to this guy who was looking for an artist to draw his script. And so I did that, and it really sustained me over a tough year. So, many thanks to Mike Allred. I'm a fan of his work. I was a fan of it before then, but directly, he helped me stay in comics at a time that whenever it looked like maybe I was going to be leaving.
All right, George, come on, right?
Legendary. All these guys, man.
Yeah, so he doesn't have to spend all day drawing a zillion Avenger heads anymore. So get him in there, man.
Yeah, he's retired now, right?
Dude, this is what I'm trying for real hard with the new Freak Brothers cartoon that's debuting on Netflix. I'm sorry, this is Gilbert. I'm sorry, I was thinking Gilbert Shelton. But I would also love Michael Gilbert, Mr. Monster, right? Love that book.
Yeah, he's somebody I've never met in person. Like that book, but also like all the history that he's brought to that book, like reprinting different golden age artists and things like that. Like he'd probably be a fun guy to talk history, comics history with.
Oh, speaking of which, you got to try to talk sometime to Bob Bierbaum, okay? Because this is a really interesting cat who owned a comic book store in San Francisco in the 70s. He actually employed some of the retailers who are on my Mount Rushmore. Like he gave Rory Root and Brian Hibbs, they've started working for him.
That is fascinating. Wow.
And he's one of the foremost experts in the world on like Platinum Age and Victorian Age comics. At least if you ask him, he is. No, I mean, the stuff that I've seen him put up, I'm just kidding, Bob, is amazing stuff. He unearths treasures that nobody's thinking about. I would recommend.
He'd be great. Have you seen the book about comic shop, like the early comic shop history?
I guess you're referring to Comic Shop by Dan Garino.
Is Bob in that book?
He is in the footnotes and he's quoted 2 times. And Dan Garino says of him that there is probably no one in the world who knows more about the foundations of the direct market than Bob Bierbaum. Okay. And he has this whole theory that I find fascinating about, okay, Phil Suling and the direct market. You know that whole story, right?
Yes.
That's only one part of the picture. It's really that plus the underground scene in the Bay Area that truly gave birth to like the direct market and what comic shops are. It's fascinating stuff.
I do love connecting all those dots. We went through the Glenn Bray collection, Blighted Eye, that Fantagraphics put out of Glenn Bray, a collector. And the book is just showing some of his collection of original comics art and things. And you start to read, there's an interview with him in the beginning of the book, and it connects some of those dots. Like, where was he finding this stuff? And it's very, 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 because it's early 70s. So it's like early comic book shops. He's on the West Coast, and would go to San Francisco now and then for that reason.
Well, one of the places you would have found him is in a shop in San Jose, okay? Was known as Comics Collector's Shop. And a guy, this is a little racy for YouTube.
You can get in trouble for that one.
A guy named Bob Sidebottom, okay? And who I found out just like this week, I didn't realize he was printing his own comics too, okay? And so this Barbarian comic, I don't know if you can tell, it's like silver ink on the cover.
Yes.
And it is so... I'm going to go all Ed Piskor, and I'm going to say this is outlaw as fuck, Jimmy. You would really like this. Not only that, dude, the guy had advertisements. Robert Crumb drew and lettered this advertisement for his comic book shop. Okay, you can't see it on this.
When is that from, Dan?
This comic was volume 1, number 1, 1972 by Bob Sidebottom. All rights reserved, California Comics, 73 East San Fernando Avenue, San Jose, California. He did this book. He did these California comics and he did these Barbarian comics. And these are racy. They're but there is some beautiful looking artwork in here. Very of the time underground stuff I don't know. I thought I would try to stump the kayfabe.
Those are good, man. Those are great. I think I have that California comics, but the Barbarian comics I do not. Woo, so I will keep my eyes peeled for it.
I bought it on Amazon.
Huh.
For like $8.
That's what I always say about all these like 80s black and white books that I love. They're not worth much. You just have to find them. Like usually they're $1 if you can find them somewhere.
Oh, and they're brilliant. And a lot of stuff from the 90s too. You ever read Scott Russo's Jizz?
I don't know if I've read that or not. Is that an Eros?
It's no, it's just Fantagraphics. It's not a pornography comic. It's deep about the comics industry.
Really?
Stuff. You want to read that book for sure.
That description sounds good, better than the title.
It's so great. It's so great. You wouldn't, and he does parodies in it of the current autobiographical indie scene. Like I think Walden Wong might have been involved with some of the. I forget who. But dude, it's amazing. Seek that if you can find it, you'll love it. Okay, so who else on our list here? Man, there's so many in comics. Gareb Shamus would be great. You say his name all the time. How about this? Would be an easy one, right? This should be.
Yeah. We should be able to put that together. Maybe we'll do that one this week.
Denny O'Neil. I'm just going to keep going, dude. Elliot R. Brown. This is the one, dude. I really want you to meet that guy so much.
It's great to know that he posts stuff at his blog. Like that's something I'll end up tracking down just to see the kind of stuff. There's so many good cartoonist old guys connected who they share a lot of this stuff online, and it's treasure troves, man.
Yes, dude. You're so right. Okay. I think we're about out of good suggestions. I apologize if I
saw two that stand out. Scott McCloud and Simon Bisley. Yeah, I'm on board for both those guys. So
Scott McCloud, how awesome would that be? I had the luck of hosting them in my store as at a signing when he was hot, and he was doing a tour at Google and Facebook, I think, or or maybe it was eBay. And I begged him to come to my store. He's like, I can't. I'm like, dude, I've been a Zot reader, and I got first printing Understanding Comics, and then I gave him a digital map that showed where he was speaking and where my comic book store was, and that it was right between. I'm like, please.
He would have loved that digital map. You're speaking his language.
Yeah, dude, and he came through, and it was great. It was a high point. That guy was amazing. I think he was a turbocharger of the entire comics medium in a way that almost nobody else is. Talk about Understanding Comics for a second, because, dude, I read it, and not even as an artist, it blew my mind as an examination of the medium, right?
I think of it as like when I started reading comics was before Understanding Comics came out. And you would always hear Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, and Mouse were like the three kind of like big perennials, before that was really a thing. And then Understanding Comics to me is the fourth one because it's taught in so many schools. How many printings has it gone through? And so many people read it, even if they're not aspiring to make comics. It's just this like, I don't know, explanation, Rosetta Stone, something to help. I think it's really one of the pivotal books that has expanded comics to wider audiences because it gave people a way to literally understand comics. But that's a weird thing we take for granted. If you don't grow up reading comics, they're weird looking.
Big time. Well, both from a hard to read perspective, but it also hard to critically analyze and give good criticism of. If you don't understand some of the inner workings of his concept of closure, to me was huge. The definition of closure of the the unspoken things that are happening between the panels, right? To me, that was eye-opening. And when you turn the pages to the color comic and it turns to full color from a black and white experience to drive home what those differences might be, the guy is brilliant.
I'm a huge fan. I don't think we can say enough. Invented 24-hour comics.
Yeah.
It's a huge, what he's contributed is giant. I don't think it can be overstated, his contribution.
All right. So get on it, Jim. All right. Any final thoughts here? I want to let you go. You've been such a great support. Any final thoughts you want to talk about?
No, not really. I thank you, Dan, for hosting me and for what you do. I mean, when we were leading up to this, I was saying, I don't think there's one solution to anything that comics is facing or probably anything the world's facing at this point. And so, there's room for all of us to come in here and talk about what the facets of comics that we love. I made the comment about Tom Spurgeon, the comics reporter, passed away last year. He was so significant to me and a lot of people. And I often say he influenced everybody in comics, even if you've never heard of him, because he was an editor at the Comics Journal for almost 10 years. And, that role is so influential. It certainly influenced me. So if you like my work, you've been influenced by Tom Spurgeon. And he was a great advocate for comics. He introduced me to so many cartoonists on his site, Comics Reporter. He would post, a lot of cartoonists that I went on to love. The first time I ever saw them mentioned was on his site. And in a lot of ways, that's what we're all doing. It's part of what I want to do with Cartoonist Kayfabe. I see you doing it here, Dan. Nobody can replace Tom Spurgeon. He did the work of 20 or 50 or 100 people, but all of us can do little bits. We can share great cartoonists that we like, that we find. We can promote that kind of stuff. And I see you doing that. It's what I want to do. It's what I do. And hopefully it's what we're all doing. You talk about the future of comics retail, and it's one thing. The only thing I'm confident of is that all of us connected with comics should be thinking about how do we bring new readers to comics. And it's whether we're creators or fans or retailers or publishers or librarians or anybody that loves comics, how do we get more people to love comics with us? And there's no shortage of ways to do it. So, you know, that would be my my mission statement for everybody that feels this way.
Thank you. And a couple of names. Can you believe, like, we didn't even, there's so many great names in comics that nobody's heard of that we didn't mention. Neil Adams, Jim Steranko, like the list goes, there's a million that we glossed over that are masters, right? That we're not even bringing up. So,
Ed and I say this all the time. Like, we're constantly, like, the first time we dig into somebody like a Steranko's work or whoever's work, and it's like, why haven't we gotten to this already on the station? There's so many great creators and great comics out there, scattered through history, and new ones every day. So there's no shortage, man. You'll never run out of great comics to talk about.
Okay, what's Ed say at the end of this show? What's the mission statement again?
Read more comics.
That's right, buddy. Can you stick around for a minute and I'll join you? I just want to wrap this thing up. I'll get out of here. I promise. All right, guys, everybody, man. All right, is that the real deal? This was Jim Rugg. We got to read more comics, folks. That's the bottom line, right? Like, Cartoonist Kayfabe is doing God's work on YouTube, in my opinion. I watch a lot of YouTube about comics, stuff I agree with, stuff I don't agree with, whatever. But there's nobody who taps into the core of everything that is about the art form. Like this channel, I'm about the business, the culture, as well as the medium. But nobody touches it like Jim and Ed on Cartoonist Kayfabe. So please go check them out. Speaking of checking things out, thank you for checking out this channel. Please consider hitting that subscribe button. Consider hitting the little bell and get notifications when we drop new videos, yada, 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 et cetera, et cetera. Thank everybody so much for watching and tuning in. Don't forget to back the comeback. Yeah, I'm a shill. There were no, but if you want to call me a shill for comics and comic shops, I'll take that any day of the week. All right. So thanks again for watching. We're going to see y'all real soon. Thanks again.